Hello, welcome to Prajim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 15 of SQL Server. In this session, we'll learn about the different ways that are available to replace null values in SQL Server. Specifically, we'll be looking at isNull function, case statement, and coalesce function. Please watch part 14 of this video series before continuing with this session. Now, I have an employee table which has got 3 columns within it: employee ID, name, and manager ID. Now, if I ask you who is the manager of Rob, you look at manager ID column. Okay, manager ID for Rob is 1, and you look up 1 within the employee ID column. Okay, 1 is Mike, so Rob's manager is Mike. So along the same lines, if you look Todd manager ID value is null, which means Todd doesn't have a manager. And if you remember, in part 14 of this video series, we have written a left outer self join to retrieve employee names along with their manager names. Okay, and this is the output that we have. Since Todd doesn't have a manager ID, his manager name is null, which makes sense. But then in the output, I don't want nulls to be displayed. Instead of nulls, if an employee doesn't have a manager, instead of displaying null value, I want to replace that with no manager. Okay, so instead of an output like this, I want an output like this. Any employee, if he doesn't have a manager, don't display nulls. Replace those null values with this no manager word. Is that possible? Absolutely. We actually have different ways to do that. We can make use of isNull, case statement, and coalesce functions. Let us look at practical examples of using each one of them. Alright, so since we are using this manager ID column and then looking up in the employee ID column, we are kind of doing a self join here. And if you're not sure about what a self join is, please watch part 14 of this video series. Okay, so let's write the left outer self join query. So select, okay, we'll come to the columns list in a bit. First, let's specify the from clause. From, let's say, TBL employee table. We'll call this as E, and I want to do a left join and join with the same table, TBL employee E, but I'm going to alias that with letter M for manager. So this is employee table, this is the manager table. So from the employee table, what do we want? If you look at the output, I want the employee name. So in the from the employee table, I want the employee name, and let's give it a meaningful name, so employee. And from the manager table, I want again the name, but this is going to be manager. Okay, so and we have to specify. So we specified the column list, we specified the employee table, we specified the manager table. We have to specify the join condition. So on E dot in the employee table, take the manager ID and look up in the manager table the employee ID column. And we have seen, we have discussed about this query in a great detail in part 14 of this video series. So now when you execute this query, we get the output, the employee names with their manager names. But then as we, like how we have it here, Todd doesn't have a manager, so he has null there. So similarly in the output here, null is displayed for Todd. But what's our ultimate aim? Our ultimate aim is basically to replace that null value with no manager word. So how do we do that? The first and the easiest way to do it is basically to use isNull function. Okay, let's see how to use isNull function. Now isNull is such a simple function. Now as the name itself suggests, is null if it is null. Okay, is null. So if you look at this function, the IntelliSense of SQL Server 2008, it shows up the first parameter. It's an expression that you pass in here. If the expression that you're passing in here, if it returns null, then there is a second parameter called replacement value. That parameter will be used. So for example, let's pass a null here for the expression, and replacement value, I'm saying, let's say, no manager. Okay, so when I execute this, what's going to happen? Look at this. Since this function is we are passing in null as the first parameter. Since this is null, it is making use of the replacement value. And look at this, the column doesn't have a name, so let's give it a meaningful name. Let's call this manager, for example. So when I execute that, look at that, since we are passing null to isNull function, it is making use of the replacement value. On the other hand, let's say instead of saying null, I'm saying prajim here. Okay, so I'm not passing null now. So when you're not passing null, and if it is not null, then that value will be used. So now instead of saying no manager, it will use that word prajim. So whatever expression that you pass in here, if it returns null, then this replacement value will be used. If it doesn't return null, then that value itself will be used. So what we have to do is we have to use this isNull function and pass in this m.name into this isNull function. When this expression returns a manager name, it will be used. But on the other hand, for Todd, it returns null. So when it returns null, it uses this no manager. And we will have no manager displayed. So let's see how to do that. You can simply copy the implementation and paste it here. Okay, now we don't want this hard-coded value. Instead, we want to pass m.name. So if this name is null, then use no manager word. Otherwise, use the value returned by m.name. So when we execute this, okay, so Todd has no manager. Pretty simple, very easy to understand. Along the same lines, you can actually use coalesce function as well. So another way to replace null value is to use coalesce function. And if you look up the definition of coalesce function in MSDN books online, it says it is used to replace, it returns the first non-null value. What do we mean by that? Don't worry about that for the time being. We're going to talk about coalesce function in a very great detail in the next session. But for now, understand that the usage of coalesce function is pretty much similar to isNull function, but there is much more to it. Okay, it is basically used to return the first non-null value. Very powerful function. We'll be talking about that piece in the next session. Okay, but what you can do is coalesce function implementation, using coalesce function is a little similar to isNull. So coalesce, and the way I follow to remember the spelling of this function, that's a little tricky. Coalesce, it's not easy to remember the spelling, but the trick I follow to remember that is I spell it like coal escape e. Okay, that's how I remember that, just in case if you want to use that trick to remember the spelling of the function. Coal, C-O-A-L, escape E. Okay, alright, coalesce, and look at this. When I execute this, I get now prajim. Okay, it's exactly similar to the way we use isNull function. Now on the other hand, if I pass null for that, when I press F5, look at that, I get no manager. But then coalesce is much more powerful than isNull. You can pass in multiple expressions to that, and it returns the first non-null expression value, which we'll be talking about in the next session in a great detail. But for now, just understand coalesce usage is much similar to isNull function. Okay, so if you want to use coalesce, all you have to do is instead of isNull, just specify coalesce, coal escape E. And when I execute this, obviously Todd, instead of displaying null, we have no manager. And the final way to do it is to use case statement. Okay, now you have this case statement is also very simple. Basically case, the way you use it is case, you specify case keyword, and then you specify an expression here. If that expression case, when you specify your expression, if that expression returns true, then what value you want, else what value you want, and then you end the case statement. So this is the syntax for the case statement. Case, when you specify the expression, this expression returns a true or a false. Okay, if that expression returns true, then use the value here. On the other hand, if it returns false, then use the value in the else part. and this is the end for case statement. So within case you can have as many expressions as you want. Okay, but here we don't, we only have one expression. Okay, so instead of using coalesce here, what you basically can do is you can also use the case statement. So case when m.name. Okay, so when m.name is null, if that is null, then I want to use no manager. Else I want to use m.name itself, whatever m.name. If it is not null, then I want to use the name that is returned by m.name, and then you can end the case expression. That's it. And then you're saying whatever value this case statement returns, that should be the value for the manager column. So this is the alias for that column. So case when m.name is null, then no manager, else m.name end. Alright, let's execute this and see the output. Okay, look at that. The output is exactly similar. So you can either use case statement, is null, or coalesce function. We'll be talking about coalesce function in a great detail in the next session. And you can see the implementation right here for 3 of them. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET and C# interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.